Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to be looking at something pretty interesting. Um, it's this whole thing with Steve Witkoff.
Steve Witkoff.
Right, the real estate guy.
Yeah, yeah.
And he went to Moscow,
Yeah.
and he met with Putin.
Met with Vladimir Putin.
Yeah,
Yeah, and he did an interview on the Tucker Carlson network on YouTube, and he talked all about it.
right.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. He didn't go as an official U.S. rep,
No.
like a diplomat.
No.
He went kind of like as a envoy from Trump, it sounds like.
An unofficial envoy
Right.
of the former president.
So that's kind of what makes this whole thing even more interesting.
Right.
Like you
Yeah.
don't really see a head of state like Putin sitting down with someone who is not officially representing, another country.
Yeah, it's very unusual.
Right. So our mission today is to kind of go through what Witkoff said in this interview
Yeah?
and try to pull out some key insights. Like, what do we learn about how Putin is thinking about U.S.-Russia relations? What about the whole situation in Ukraine? And then there's this whole other thing about Trump, which is really interesting, too.
A personal anecdote.
Yeah. So let's get into it. First of all, what did Witkoff think of Putin, just as a person?
Well, he said, I liked him. That's a direct quote. And he goes on to say, I thought he was straight up with me.
So, he felt like Putin was honest.
Yeah, he got the impression that, despite all the geopolitical tension, Putin was very direct and upfront with him.
Yeah, and I think he even says that, other people have said that, too, right?
He name drops a bunch of former U.S. presidents.
Yeah.
Clinton, Bush, Obama.
Right. So, he's saying even these guys who, politically we think of as being, opposite of Trump, maybe they also thought that Putin was straightforward.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
And so what's interesting to think about is, what does that mean? Does that tell us anything about Putin, or is it just, a coincidence?
Hard to say, but it definitely suggests that Putin cultivates this persona of being very direct in his interactions.
Right.
And Witkoff goes on to say that this is important. Establishing some kind of trust or good feeling is crucial when you're dealing with a nuclear power.
Of course.
I mean, the stakes are incredibly high.
Yeah.
Any kind of miscalculation could be devastating.
Right. So it's interesting to think about how these personal relationships might play into that whole thing.
Yeah, it's a complex dynamic.
So how did Witkoff feel about even getting this meeting with Putin?
He definitely seemed to appreciate it. He even says at one point, first of all, I thought it was gracious of him to accept me.
Yeah.
To see me.
So he understood that Putin was doing him a favor, basically.
Yeah.
I mean, he wasn't a, official representative.
Right.
So Putin could have just said no.
Exactly.
So why do you think Putin agreed to meet with him?
Well, Witkoff points to the relationship that Trump and Putin had during Trump's presidency. He says they had a great relationship, so maybe Putin was willing to extend that courtesy to someone who was close to Trump.
Yeah, maybe. And I think Witkoff also suggested that, Putin understood that it was tough for Trump to go to Russia at that time. But, maybe in the future they could meet again.
Yeah, maybe. He hinted at that. So even though there's no official dialogue, maybe these back channels are still open.
Okay, so what did we learn about how Putin is viewing the lack of communication with the U.S., like with Biden?
Witkoff says that Putin told him straight up. He hasn't spoken to Joe Biden in 3.5 years.
Wow.
And he called it craziness. So clearly, he's not happy about this lack of communication at the highest levels.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of scary when you think about it.
Yeah.
The two biggest nuclear powers in the world and their leaders aren't even talking.
It's a recipe for disaster.
Right. And Witkoff makes this really good analogy. He's like, imagine you have a land dispute with your neighbor, but you never actually talk to them about it.
You just seethe and stew.
Yeah. How are you ever going to resolve anything? And he's saying it's even more serious when you're talking about nuclear war.
Exactly.
So why did Witkoff even go on this trip in the first place?
He says he was worried.
About
the escalating tensions and the possibility of things getting out of control.
Oh, yeah, the whole nuclear thing.
Exactly. And since the official channels were basically frozen, he felt like someone needed to at least get Putin's perspective out there.
So he saw himself as a messenger?
Yeah.
Did Witkoff think that his meeting had any immediate impact?
He seemed to think so.
Really?
Yeah. He pointed to a few things that happened after his first meeting, like a Black Sea moratorium, and then there were some discussions about a moratorium on energy infrastructure, and then there were some prisoner exchanges, too, and he claims that none of these things were even on the table before his meeting.
So he's suggesting that Trump sending him to talk to Putin actually made a difference.
That's what he's saying.
And what was the main message that Witkoff was trying to get across to Putin?
That Trump wanted to rebuild their relationship. And that he wanted to work together to find a way to end the war in Ukraine.
So like a peacemaker kind of role.
Yeah, basically.
And then there was a second meeting, right? What happened there?
Well, this one was a little more personal. Putin had commissioned a portrait of Trump.
Wow.
Yeah, from like a leading Russian artist. And he gave it to Witkoff to bring back to Trump.
Like a gift.
Yeah, a very interesting gesture.
Right.
It definitely suggests that Putin wants to maintain some level of goodwill.
Or maybe just with Trump personally.
Maybe. But then there's this other anecdote that Witkoff tells, which is even more surprising.
I know you're going to say.
The one about Putin praying for Trump.
Yeah.
So Witkoff says Putin told him that when Trump was shot...
We're assuming this is referring to like past assassination attempts or something.
Yeah, probably. So when that happened, Putin said he went to his local church, talked to his priest, and prayed for Trump.
Really?
Yeah, and he said he did it not just because Trump was the U.S. president, but because they were friends.
That is really surprising.
It is. It humanizes Putin in a way that we don't often see.
Right. It suggests a much closer bond between him and Trump than you would expect based on all the political stuff.
Exactly. And Witkoff talks about how he got emotional when he heard this story and how when he told Trump about it, Trump was really touched.
Wow. I mean, it's a pretty powerful story.
It is. And it kind of goes back to what we were talking about before about the importance of personal relationships in international affairs.
Right.
Because sometimes things happen behind the scenes that we have no idea about.
Right. Like this whole thing with Putin praying for Trump. Who would have thought?
Exactly.
And Witkoff uses this to make a broader point. He talks about how a simple word called communication can help to rebuild connections. And then he addresses the elephant in the room, right? The whole Putin is a bad guy thing.
Right.
But Witkoff's point is that it's more complicated than that.
He compares it to a marriage. He's saying you can't just blame one side for everything that goes wrong.
Right, it's a two-way street.
Yeah. And I think that's an important point to keep in mind when we're talking about U.S.-Russia relations.
Okay, so then Witkoff talks about something else that I found really interesting.
What's that?
He talks about how he thinks that in the U.S., we don't really hear the Russian side of things. Like he even uses the word censorship.
Yeah, he asks, why is it so hard for Americans to hear the other side of the conflict?
Right.
And he even shares his own personal experience with this. He says he's done other interviews where he said positive things about Trump and those parts were edited out.
Wow.
So he sees that as evidence of this bias against Trump.
Right. And then he talks about Trump derangement syndrome.
Yeah, he uses this analogy of a cancer cure that's rejected by the opposing side just because they don't like the person who discovered it.
It's a pretty strong analogy.
It is.
But it shows you how strongly he feels about this.
Yeah, he really believes that there's a concerted effort to silence pro-Trump voices.
So what about the Ukraine conflict? What do they talk about that?
Well, Witkoff starts off by acknowledging Zelensky's bravery.
Right.
And the valor of the Ukrainian military. But he also points out that they're up against a much bigger adversary.
Yeah, Russia's a lot bigger than Ukraine.
Right. And according to Witkoff, the Russian position is that they can't sign a treaty with Zelensky.
Why not?
Because they don't think he has a legitimate mandate from the people.
Oh.
They don't believe the elections were fair.
So what do they want? Like new elections?
Well, both Witkoff and the interviewer seem to think that eventually there will be elections in Ukraine.
Okay. So they're just waiting for that.
It sounds like it.
So what's Witkoff's takeaway from all of this?
He thinks Zelensky is in a tough spot.
Yeah.
He's facing a nuclear power with a way bigger population.
Right.
So he's suggesting that maybe Zelensky needs to cut a deal. That maybe that's the only realistic way out of this.
Okay, so let's wrap this up.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot of ground here. What are the key things that we learned from Witkoff's story?
Well, first of all, we got his personal impressions of Putin. He seemed to like him, thought he was straightforward. We also got a sense of how Putin is feeling about the lack of communication with the U.S. And then there's Witkoff's claim that his trip as Trump's envoy led to some positive development.
Right.
And of course, we can't forget that incredible anecdote about Putin praying for Trump.
Right.
And then there's Witkoff's perspective on the whole U.S.-Russia relationship and the situation in Ukraine.
Yeah, and also his feeling that there's this kind of censorship happening in the U.S. where we don't really get to hear the Russian side of things.
Right.
So much to unpack here.
It really is.
It definitely makes you think.
It does. And it leaves us with a final thought. How much do personal relationships and communication really matter on the world stage? Like we saw with Putin and Trump, sometimes these things happen behind the scenes that can have a huge impact on global events.
Yeah, and we may never even know about them.
It's a fascinating and also kind of unsettling thought.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, well, on that note, thanks for joining us for the deep dive. We'll be back next time with another fascinating story from the world of, well, international intrigue.
You got it.
Until then, stay curious.
Stay curious.